Hello and welcome to Community Thinkers, a broadcast mini-series of the Summit Hill Association. Thanks for joining us. In this series, we hear from one of St. Paul's most thoughtful people about issues that matter to Summit Hill neighbors and St. Paul neighbors. I'm Sherry Johnson. I'm a process guide, inclusion trainer, and complexity coach. I'm also a board member here at Summit Hill Association.
And I'm Monica Haas, Executive Director of the Summit Hill Association. I'm your go-to gal for information and connection. What is this series, Community Thinkers? We're hosting this series to engage our community as we renew our neighborhood plan. We're finding that the more we learn about planning, sustainability, racial equity, economic development, and more, we realize how much more we have to learn.
No kidding. So this show is for you. So after I get things started with our guests with a few questions, we're going to turn to the chat where Monica will share your questions with our guest. So before we hear from our guest, practice. Go ahead and put your name in the comments and just get started out. You can ask your questions now and we'll get to them later, or just share with us what brought you here today. We'd love to know. So the community thinker we've asked to join us today is Terry Tao. Terry has served on the St. Paul Planning Commission and the State Board of Minnesota Housing. She's held key positions for nonprofits like the Asian Economic Development Association and Neighborhood House, and currently serves as Program Director for Nexus Community Partners. So we're going to talk today about neighborhood planning and equity. And I'd imagine, given Terry's wide-ranging background, our discussion could touch on everything from housing to economic development. Welcome, Terry.
Oh, thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no kidding. And I'm so excited to talk to you today. I would love to hear, let's start, just what is your personal history in shaping policy in St. Paul?
Personal history. Well, it goes back to my own story, right? So growing up, particularly as a second generation Hmong American here, a lot of, so my family story, a lot of Hmong folks moved to St. Paul. The big migration was in the late 80s. And a lot of it was to join with families. But in addition to that, there was actually two really important things happening here in St. Paul. One was that there was affordable housing, namely a lot of public housing available at that time, and there were jobs. And so jobs, housing, and family, well, everyone's going to come here. And that's how we saw the growth of the Hmong community in St. Paul. So I was actually part of that first wave, and it's been really neat to see the community grow. I grew up in the Frogtown area with my family. I'm the oldest of six. And so I'm a St. Paul girl through and through. I live over here on the east side. My husband's an east sider, so we bought a house here about 14 years ago. And so, and just, I think by virtue of like growing up in the community, being involved in a lot of community efforts, especially as a young person, because as a young, my parents were, poor working class folks, right? And so being exposed to different groups of folks, different experiences was something I said yes to a lot of things, which is how I ended up participating on a lot of community boards, nonprofit boards, and then later on public boards, right? And so, but they were all near and dear to me because they all dealt with issues that we were experiencing in the Hmong community. And so, my family also, my background is not only just, in the field of community economic development, housing, but also in small businesses, right? My family had a small business on University Avenue. And so that's why I joined the board of ADA. And so, so definitely understanding kind of a lot of the issues and plights of running a small business, having been an entrepreneur myself too. So, so a lot of that, my personal history is actually what shapes how I decide policy. And then it also is interesting. I also have a formal degree in public policy. So I also went to the Humphrey Institute many, many years ago. So I come with that technical training and having spent now about 16 years in the field of community economic development, know enough to be dangerous, but also have been able to practice what I've learned in lots of settings, right? Certainly on the Planning Commission, I served for 9 years. Now still on the Board of Minnesota Housing, we borrow money and help produce affordable housing across the state.
So yes, this is why I'm so excited to have you here today. So many of our questions today, you're a wonderful person to have here. So as we've been working on our neighborhood plan here in the Summit Hill Association, one of the things we're hearing from the community is this desire to be more inclusive, to increase racial and socioeconomic diversity. What might that look like for a neighborhood like Summit Hill?
Well, the other thing I wanted to share too is actually I didn't even talk about my day job real quick because it relates,
yeah,
right?
go.
And so, I've been at Nexus for actually about 16 years. I run a leadership program called the Boards and Commissions Leadership Institute, where we train and help place BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, people of color, on public boards and commissions. And I've been doing that for about 8 years now. So in the program, I actually train on these topics of economic development, health, housing, transit, and workforce, all overlaid with a racial equity lens. So again, this work is it's the intersection, what I do professionally, of all these amazing things. But I think as this question about is Summit Hill striving, I appreciate you doing these events as part of your neighborhood plan. It is about the engagement, right? How are you out there talking with folks? If you're trying to increase diversity, start with the data you have, right? We're gonna soon, hopefully, we'll see census data for 2020, right? Look at the percentages. I think I snuck a peek earlier at what Minnesota Compass says about Summit Hill. It says your population is about 13% BIPOC community members. So you should at least try to get to parity. Do we have 13% represented in our board, if not more, right? And so I think as you talk about it, to start with some metrics, but then also ask who is missing from our tables, right? And where do we need, and how do we engage conversations so we can have better and greater participation. And so there's that piece, the engagement part. There's another part about to be more inclusive is actually to be intentional and to create plans then that incorporate those diverse voices and ideas and policies. And then on the end piece, to be accountable and report back on the work that you've actually done. And so I think that's, certainly a lot of people incorporate the voices is critical, but then actually being intentional about the policies directions is key too.
Sure, yeah. So speaking of policy, I mean, what are some ways that neighborhood plans can impact racial equity for good or ill?
I think we always have to ask this question of in plans of who is burdened and who benefits, right? So when we pass policies that are about zoning laws that don't allow density, we have to ask who is burdened and who benefits, right? And a lot of times when we don't allow density in districts, what it means is folks as renters who, by the way, most people have been renters, have had that experience. And actually, the majority of the city actually is renters. I think we're slightly like 50% in the city. So we need to think about and also how we're planning for the future. So as we think about the policies we want to pass, policies become how we prescribe our values on paper, and it's the standard we're going to hold ourselves up to. So, and how we care for each other. So if we're talking about racial equity, so making sure that the policies we pass do not have detrimental impacts on different racial groups is going to be really key. So being asking the question, but then also being intentional. So for example, if you have a policy around growing small businesses, but you do not have a lot of Black businesses, for example, then you are intentional and you say, we are going to try to create Black or other Black or Indigenous people of color businesses. I will say that's actually work we did on the East Side. I was actually on the board of the East Side Neighborhood Development Company, so the CDC that's doing work on Payne Avenue and Arcade here. And we said one of our board members said, we have to be conscious. And so we were like, okay, how do we increase particularly Black-owned businesses along our corridors? And so as we create plans, it's okay to have targeted approaches, much like you would have nodes, right? You have your targeted nodes that you're going to be developing for, whether it's transit-oriented development or you're going to try to, do different types of development in those sites. We can also be intentional too with different populations.
I'm going to ask a follow-up question on that. One of the things that we discovered, we've recently done a neighborhood survey, and we got pretty representative results back across demographics and numbers. But what we found was that really, really high on the list for our neighborhood is this passion for racial equity and economic justice. But then toward the bottom of the list were things like jobs, housing. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's kind of a paradox, right? How would you say, what's our role as Summit Hill in addressing that seeming paradox or contradiction?
I would say I would not have it be a paradox. I would say it's actually a challenge and opportunity for Summit Hill to rise to. If your value is to racial equity, how you implement it is thinking about your plan to create jobs and housing, right? And so the goal is racial equity. The how is through jobs and housing. how are you creating job centers, right? Job centers that pay livable wages for families, because we all know the racial wealth gap in this country, and particularly the other disparities we have here in Minnesota in particular. So I would encourage you to think that if your goals are around trying to increase racial equities and parity for experience, then the policies need to be put in place. And they could be things like, I've seen other districts do things like subsidize different types of developments because again of the racial wealth gap, right? And so I would really encourage the Summit Hill Association to think about how you then create policies to get at those goals. I would also encourage you all to think about to get to a shared analysis and definition of what that means for your area too, right? Because I think so many times people think, oh, even equity versus equality is a big debate that we have to be clear of people, and then racial equity. So targeted strategies, different strategies for different groups of people also have to be people have to understand that common language, right? Because otherwise people think it's something else. And particularly in Minnesota, we love equality, right? We love being fair. It's very Minnesotan, right? But fairness has not gotten us the best outcomes, has actually gotten us pretty dismal outcomes for different racial ethnic groups.
The Minnesota paradox.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We also should not be paralyzed by the paradox, by the way. I think a lot of times in policy circles, people are like, oh, what do we do? And we admire the problem. Let's not admire it. Actually, the solutions are now. What I appreciate is that folks from the private sector, groups like yourself, are coming forward and saying, we need to work on this. And so now we're moving from admiring to actual implementation, but do not do the implementation without being informed by the people who have those lived experiences.
Thank you. Yeah. So then the last question that I'm going to ask, and I'm going to ask it of all our guests, is if you could snap your fingers and have your wish be granted, what do you wish everyone knew about planning?
Oh, there's so many things to know about planning. I think that it's in its roots too. It comes out of, planning comes out of a history of how we think about cities and how we make decisions about how we're going to take care of each other. So we have to be intentional about it. And it's really about the long game, right? These plans are 10, 20 years, right? And so, and even with exceptional things such as a pandemic impacting it, that may shift it, we know they're still really important. It can get very technical, but at its core, I think if we think about it as how we think about each other, how we think about our future, to borrow from the Native and Indigenous communities, the 7 generations, right? And so the ones ahead of us as well as the ones behind us, I think that's going to be really important. I think right now people think of it as very technical, but zoning, for example, really dictates where people can live and where they can open businesses, live, work, and play. And so I think as we think about the impacts, what that means, it'll be key. I also think sometimes, I was just having a conversation this week around modern day planning comes out of this very old school kind of thinking, right? And so, and we may have to shift the way we think about those things, right? And how we think, and it really came out of reactionary, right? No one wanted to live next to these horrible factories that were emitting, smoke, right? And emitting all these horrible environmental impacts. And so, that's how the original zoning code got formed. And so planning is key. But also the other thing I wish people would understand about planning too is it's also about accountability. Like, what did we do at the end of the day, right? And so.
Yeah. Well, so now it's time to look. Do we have any questions in chat, Monica? I'm not seeing them in Be Live, but
yes, we not as of yet.
Oh, not as of yet. Well, I have questions from Twitter that came to me via Twitter, so I'm just going to ask those. So one of the questions that came in via Twitter before this show was to talk a little bit about economic development scorecards, if you would, and the role that they play in planning. And there was concern that when more affluent neighbors, such as Summit Hill, use scorecards. Well, first of all, go ahead and define, Terry. What is an economic development scorecard, and how do those get used in neighborhoods?
Well, I will say currently right now in the Twin Cities, the Alliance for Metro Health and Stability, which is a coalition of organizations working on housing justice, racial equity, planning issues, as well as Nexus, they host the actual equitable development scorecard. So you can actually go on the Alliance's website and look up the scorecard, and it gives some suggestions about how you might want to bring communities together and to create criteria to score projects and initiatives, right? And so, but part of it is it's a tool. But as we know, of any tool, whether it be a hammer or a scorecard, we have to understand the context we use it in. We have to understand the audience it's impacting, right? And so my good friends at the Alliance will always say, don't try this at home, right? The scorecard is part and parcel with the community engagement that you do with communities impacted by the issues and stakeholders. And then, to create that criteria, right? Because actually, sometimes we've seen the scorecard to that tweet, to that person who tweeted's concern, it has been used to justify some developments that really haven't been in favor of community, because or they'll take some of the considerations, not all the considerations. And so it might be worthwhile it's a great tool. I love it. It's beautifully designed, right? And so the Equitable Development Scorecard, and I think it was the first attempt in the region. I don't know how many other scorecards are actually across the country, but it's a helpful guide. But again, don't try this at home. But I will say that some communities, actually, if you're talking about sister community organizations, I do know that Wesco, sorry, Monica, over the Wesco folks do actually have used the scorecard, and they have incorporated it into their neighborhood plans. And so one option is to actually do that. But that came with a lot of community engagement. And actually now one of their organizers, who also trains in my program, is actually making sure that the scorecard, how is it being met, is following up on the accountability pieces. And so it's again a helpful tool, but please, use it. It's with some great caution about in different contexts, right? And with engagement. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. It looks like we have something. Monica, come on and join us. Who do we got?
We have Luke Hansen. He has a question. SHA is thinking mostly about planning for their specific neighborhood. But what Terry just said about citywide planning suggests the decisions of one neighborhood affect neighborhoods across the city. Can you elaborate on how SHA can prioritize the needs of the entire city and of other neighborhoods as they build a plan for their own neighborhood?
That's a great question. Hey, Luke. That's a great question. I think sometimes in a neighborhood, I think Summit Hill, again, go back to your demographics, right? Neighborhoods in St. Paul are very unique. The history of the city built out is pretty unique. It's steeped in the history of redlining and some other really, not so great practices. So place matters. So for Summit Hill, I think the opportunity here is to take what is a predominantly white neighborhood and to try to figure out if you can solve and address racial equity in Summit Hill, we can do it across the city, frankly. We could do it in Highland Park. We can do it over here on the east side. So I think that's the opportunity to think about too, is that you could be a model for other neighborhoods, heck, even across the river to our, Minneapolis, right? So to neighborhoods there to try to model, right? And so what's possible. And certainly, because corridors are different, like the Grand Avenue business corridor is going to be really different from, Payne Avenue, right? It's just going to, but there are a lot of lessons to be learned too. I think about that, so as you think about your work, there's being intentional with it as a model and then sharing your story too of how you've been able to do the work. And certainly because that has implications for the city, because I think so many people are inspired by, if it happened over here, we can try it in this neighborhood or we can try it here. And so, but we need these stories to kind of motivate and as models or examples for us, right? So absolutely, you should think about the city's impact. And sometimes you start with a neighborhood, like we've been doing, I remember initial work around accessory dwelling units, so housing background, so having smaller, not quite the tiny homes, but smaller unit homes on lots. Right. And so that started at a different neighborhood level. And then it's going, it started small and then is citywide. So I think that's also, again, the opportunity too for Summit Hill to think about their impact on the city. And let's be real. I mean, Summit Hill has a lot of wealth, a lot of people there who have all sorts of different positional power, and the ability to influence is really strong. So use the power for good.
That's awesome. Thank you. I think, so what I'm hearing is look for opportunities for naturally occurring affordable housing, and sort of these ADUs is one of those ways. One of the things we're facing right now, just looking at our history and demographics, is as developers are coming in, because it's Summit Hill, there's this ethos where some folks, even pro-housing advocates, will say, well, this is the neighborhood where you don't do any affordable units, right? This is the neighborhood that can take the brunt of some of that just straight market rate housing, and leave the affordability elsewhere. What's your position on that? What's your thinking?
No, every neighborhood should have a variety of housing choices, right? At income levels. And the fact is, St. Paul's a poorer city, right, than Minneapolis. We have less of a tax base because we're the capital city. So we also need to, and so therefore, and a lot of, and so we need to have, all neighborhoods need to have a lot of different types of housing, including affordable housing. And when we say affordable, 30% area median income. Usually these are folks sometimes not working, or people who maybe live on, an SSI benefit, right? So we need to have that housing all across the city, because guess who's an emerging population in that demographic group? It's seniors, right? People that actually don't think, but the growing number of seniors living in poverty is a high number. And so, and needless to say, seniors of color too, who have been at those levels for a while. So, so I think that's some, as we think about affordability. And then you have areas here. I mean, sometimes on the east side, the pushback will be, we have too much affordable housing. We need market rate, right? I have heard that over the years too. And so some neighborhoods have borne the brunt because of the way planning and history has been determined, right? And so, needless to say, it needs to be about an equal equitable distribution.
Thanks. And then because you're a wonk, I'm wondering if you have ideas for us about what kinds of ways what can we do to advocate for affordable units with developers, say, or any small or large developers?
You could put it in your plan. Just be intentional. I mean, I would push you to think 30%, 25%, right? And at different levels. Most people, the 50 to 60% level, those are folks working like the $15 an hour jobs, right? It's a nursing, the teacher's aide, right? And to really think about that, you could actually put it in your plan. I think too, there is this huge perception about renters. A lot of it is racially coded, frankly, right? And so, but again, it's like 95% of people have been renters. So I think people have to remember the rental experience too. But also have to remember, landlords are a key part of this too. Landlords make, they make money off of the renters too as well. So so all to say too is it's not bad. We're not harping against landlords. We want good quality housing. It's the bad landlords that we don't like, right? The ones that, are violating all sorts of health and, health code and things like that quality housing, right? And so, so I think as you think about it too, it's dispelling some of these myths around housing and density that I think for folks. And so it's so funny. Everyone's like, oh, people are so close to me. I'm like, we live in the city. The city's supposed to have a lot of people here, so.
Yeah. Well, how are we doing on the chat, Monica? Anything coming in that I'm not seeing?
No new questions, sir. So for those of you watching, here's your chance.
We'll wait just a second. But while we're waiting, I guess I also have a question about business development, right? We've got Grand Avenue Corridor, we've got some vacancies. I'm going to switch to your other hat that you wear. What are some ways that we as a neighborhood association could encourage BIPOC entrepreneurship, or maybe a second location opening here on Grand?
I would say talk to all the amazing ethnic our CDC's community development corporations of color, right? Because they are working with some amazing entrepreneurs. I will say in BIPOC communities, there is a ton of entrepreneurial energy. I will find folks way younger than me who have degrees, who worked maybe in, there's actually a business open down the street here. She was like a health inspector, and she decided, she and her husband were like, no, we're going to open a boba shop instead down the street from where we live. And so I think, the renewed energy, even in this economy, there's a little bit about how we have to help folks now to get them through the pandemic, but there is a lot of energy. You know, Ada is well known for the huge night market. And what people think night market's like this really cute event. It's actually a business incubator. And so one year, 2 of the businesses went from a tent to a brick and mortar storefront in 4 months. That is unheard of, I think, in business development areas, right? But that because they were very popular. I waited in line for their this was the Thai rolled ice cream products.
Oh,
but,
yeah.
So to now where Wonders is at the mall, right? So I think to tap into where there is entrepreneurial energy, right? And so because I think there is a lot in BIPOC communities. There's not just with the CDCs, the nonprofits, but if you go on Facebook groups, like for example, the Hmong Wedding Fair had like at least 70 vendors, right? And so there are people who have all sorts of side businesses and side hustles that they want to take to the mainstream. So it is about getting to some of these very small subgroups, and sub pages, but there is a lot of entrepreneurial energy, and so which I get really excited by, because that's how we're going to grow. That's how we're going to grow our local economy, local jobs here, and the growth in St. Paul. And I think that's why people stay in St. Paul too, for the same reason.
Yeah, that's awesome. Looks like Luke has another question, Monica.
Mm-hmm. Luke, how do you think streets can be redesigned to advance equity goals in St. Paul? Sidewalks, bikes, transit, etc.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, this is something we worked on lots at the Planning Commission, right? And so I'm really following a lot of the great examples from like New York, moving to plazas, people using less streets, the open streets kind of, idea in a lot of different neighborhoods where they close down the streets to just make it a more walkable community. So I think streets are key piece. Obviously, I think for a lot of folks, it's simple things like reducing, design, so we can reduce traffic counts, we can make things more pedestrian friendly. Unfortunately, here on the east side, actually the street where I live, just right up at the major intersection, there have been some pretty fatal accidents there, right? And so there are things just around design and safety that we can do. But I think there's a bigger piece too when we think about it from a racial equity perspective is, most people, unfortunately, even in will use cars, because for a lot of BIPOC communities, particularly when I think of the Hmong community, they work manufacturing jobs. Those jobs are in the suburbs, so they will need cars, right? So the extent of which traffic volume, may stay the same, or it actually may increase, because then I know families who have multiple cars because they're large families too, and so we have to consider that. So like my neighbors next door have like a couple of their mid-20s children still living with them. Housing affordability is another issue, but so they'll need cars to get to their workplaces. And so I think that's, as we think about part of the reason why economic development has to be local, but if they can walk down the street to their job or work closer, then we have less of those issues. Or as we've seen in pandemic, the ability to work from home, so actually total reduction in, greenhouse gases and cars and use will reduce the need for road repair, wear and tear. St. Paul roads. We know about St. Paul roads. And so I can meet any St. Paul lane. We talk about roads all day, but yeah, so it's critical. And biking, I think there's a lot of people who already enjoy it like as a pastime. So again, having opportunities for families to participate so they can start to think about that as a dominant mode of transportation, right? These, like I see all sorts of possibilities with how we rethink streets, right? And so.
Yeah, and I never even thought about parking as an equity issue.
Yeah. And I think we also have to think too, for a lot of in St. Paul, I know things like Hmong Village, Hmong Town, a lot of our ethnic malls are destination based because our communities live in Woodbury, they live in the suburbs, right? They've moved out to other communities and so to other areas. And so parking then becomes an issue because their destination, their draws, right? And so so for good or bad, we also spent numerous hours on parking. I know the city right now is working on some parking, continuing to look at parking minimum standards too.
Yeah, for sure. All right.
So I'm going to give Luke the microphone one more time.
Go for it.
How do you feel about community land trusts as a tool for building